already seeing France talk about boots on the ground. And let's unpack that a little bit. Some in the West get panicky, but actually what you're trying to do is change the calculus of Putin. You're trying to say, this is now on the table, and if this happens, would I be able to live with the consequences of that? And almost certainly Russia angle will be no, he couldn't. So therefore it starts to reduce Putin's timeline in which he needs to get results done. In other words, if his special military operation really is about the Donbass, the land bridge and Crimea, he hasn't yet gone the Donbass, then all of a sudden he might push a bit harder because he doesn't think he has as much time. And if he pushes harder, that actually creates an opportunity for Ukraine as well. So I do think things like boots on the ground, that's one. Do I think we're going to see that happening anytime soon? No, I don't. Another one is a no-fly zone. That was talked about for many times. It's a whole podcast worth of discussion to get into the whys and the wherefores. That I'm very happy to contribute to that. But I think in principle, that is something that I think is viable, because whilst there's all sorts of things that will create difficulties, it wasn't the right thing at the start of the war. But actually, the Russian Air Force has finally got itself in some form of order. Glide bombs are causing carnage on the front line. And I think most of the West believe that a no-fly zone would be incredibly difficult for Russia to combat and could absolutely swing the pendulum in Ukraine's benefit. The other one, of course, is the freedom to use more modern weapons into Russia as well as in Ukraine. That I think the more modern weapons I'm more cautious about, because your defence, James, my defence, our national interest is in the technology that our modern weapons contain, and that sows doubt into our enemies. If we were to use those today to help Ukraine, they would fall into Russian hands. Therefore, that would compromise our own national security. And I'm not entirely sure that our military masters or our political masters are ready to do that. And I think there will be some really significant challenges strategically if that were to happen. But do I think there are other things that could be done? Yes. Do I think we're going to see some of those? Yes. But I also think we're not just going to see this effort on the battlefield. We're going to see a lot more effort in the political and the economic sphere, all of which designed not to put pressure onto Putin, but to put pressure on the layer below him that historically every now and again says, this ain't working. We used to enjoy sending our children to the UK. We'd like to have them educated at Oxford and Cambridge. We like going to Harrods for shopping. We like going, all of those things that they can't do at the moment. And actually, if they see the pendulum swing against them, then actually by solving the Putin problem, that might resolve the war. So we'll see. America has been very careful to say that given the opening of a second front or potential second front around Kharkiv by the Russians, that the US recognizes that Ukraine will need to use weapons outside of Ukrainian territory, but it has been very clear it's in the defense of Kharkiv, so it hasn't given carte blanche. Secondly, it said they must be targeting military targets, not civilian. And thirdly, my understanding is that they've not included ATACMS, that army tactical missile system, in that caveat, which is about 300-kilometer range. So, but in a way, even though there are caveats, I'm a great believer you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either do allow that stuff to target or not. And America now has said they can. And they joined sort of UK, the French, the Poles and the Germans, all of which have taken the shackles off the ability to use these weapons deeper within Russian territory. And I think that will be pretty significant. Let's give you an example. When this second front around Kharkiv opened up, for several months, Ukraine has known that Russia has been massing troops, between 30 and 50,000 troops in the area, but it couldn't do anything about it. And it had to wait until they came across the border. If they had had the weapons to attack those, they would have undoubtedly caused a lot of difficulty for Russia. You can't easily mass 50,000 people and keep them hidden. Because it's not just about the people, it's the vehicles, it's the weapons, it's the food, it's the logistics. They come with a huge tail. So able to target those would be really, really useful for the Ukrainians. Whilst Putin is the front of house, the real power history shows is with the oligarchs, with the generals and stuff like that. And if they generally see their quality of life imploding, there's normally a correction of some form, and Russia self-corrects itself. And I think what the West has decided is that, yes, military is important, but also politically, Russia wants to be great again. Their leader's been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and there are other things that can be done against the wider body of Russian support in the war. And the economic one is that, at the moment, Russia's spending 40% of its spending on defense. That's just not sustainable. I mean, all of the other things that you would be spending money on as a government, loads of them aren't being spent. People are hemorrhaging away from the country. It's not investing in the long term. And Russia had, I think it was about 700 billion of reserves. That's down at about 200 billion now. And some of that has been locked away, frozen by the West. And then remember, there's been this discussion about, we can't take that money off Putin. That will be illegal. It does look likely now they've decided it will be illegal to take the money off him, but the interest it's earning is not illegal. So actually, if we were to seize that 200 billion, and if we were to lock it into a bond and let the money come out in 40 years' time, then the interest is worth money, and you could give that lump sum in advance to Ukraine. And so there's all sorts of different ways, I think, that the West is going to apply pressure across these three lines, but you must make sure the military one doesn't fail. But it doesn't mean that you have to win on the battlefield in order to achieve the long-term strategic objectives for Ukraine. And you only have to look at the number of tanks that Russia has lost, which they don't dispute. They're bringing their old Second World War tanks out of storage to throw at the battlefield. They are struggling for equipment. So even if they do make a breakthrough, most military analysts don't think that they're going to make a strategic breakthrough. In other words, start taking significantly more chunks of Ukrainian land. But that then calls into, what do we think Putin's new objective is? His objective initially was to take Ukraine, 3 days, probably maximum. We're now here at 800 days, over 800 days into the campaign. I think Russia originally at its peak had 17% of the territory of Ukraine. I understand now it's down to 11%. So notwithstanding the tactical here or there, toings and froings, Russia is struggling on the battlefield. It's trying to capitalize on this shortage of weapons and will probably pay a big price for that. If you were a military man, you'd be going, right, this is an opportunity to capitalize. I don't care what the human cost is. Just throw the bodies at the front line, because ultimately we'll break through and make a strategic breakthrough. And therefore, it's quite possible that for the next couple of months, Russia will be taking that sort of tactical approach to this conflict. And it's quite possible they'll pay a huge price on the battlefield for it.
Looking at the geopolitics of the wider war, I wonder how significant you feel, Sean, the relationship between Moscow and Beijing is, because you've got President Zelensky accusing China of working with Russia to undermine his upcoming Global Peace Summit in Switzerland. And there is a suspicion, even though China publicly says it is neutral in the conflict, that Chinese components are being used by Russia. How significant would you say the relationship is between the two countries?
Well, there's a lot in there, James. First of all, yes, I've no doubt Chinese components are being used for Russia. Unfortunately, so are American, so are British. So before we become too critical, Russia's got very effective at finding its way around sanctions. And in a world of economics, people are always prepared to pay good money to get what they need. And there's no doubt that some of the Shahid drones that have been shot down, some of the missiles that have been shot down, even North Korea, they have packed full of Western technology. So there's a real question to be answered there. The interesting, I think, going to your core of your question, though, about Xi Jinping and Putin, before the war started, if you ever saw them on the global stage, they looked both literally and metaphorically similar-sized people. When you see them together now, Russia appears to be the subordinate. Russia needs China far more than China needs Russia. The worry here, of course, is that Russia is trying to generate an axis of evil. Let's use some melodramatic terms, where you have China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, who have a vested interest in operating and creating an alternative to NATO as being deadly. There is a risk of that, no doubt. But what we also have to be careful of here is that China is not Russia. China has some economic challenges of its own at the moment. And China, most of its business is done through its export markets, vast quantities of exports to the rest of the world. You'll remember not that long ago that America said there was something like 10 times as many imports from China as there were exports, and trying to get that better balanced. If China was to fall foul of the West, you'd imagine those imports would stop almost immediately. Now, there are some that things like 5G, which are clearly would be uncomfortable if you lost that. But a lot of China is known for just cheap and cheerful stuff, clothing, cheap goodies and stuff like that. You can stop those being exported in a heartbeat. So China would massively suffer economically if it was to actually take sides. What's far more likely is that China's got one eye on Taiwan at the moment and is sort of going, if I go into Taiwan, what will happen? And Russia went into Ukraine. And in reality, whilst the West has helped Ukraine, it will not go in directly and help it so far. So almost certainly, Taiwan would not provoke America and the UK to rush to military aid. That's what China will judge. But it will have to deal with the consequences. And it might have thought before Russia invaded Ukraine that the consequences might have been palatable, because the West would blink a little bit and then a couple of years will go by and everything will be back to normal. It's probably watched what's happened to Russia in Ukraine and gone, actually, this could have longer term consequences. And I think, therefore, whilst there is a danger that China and Russia are in bed together, in reality, I think China is strategically far more looking far further ahead, being far more measured, understands that the West is vital to its long-term prosperity, at least at the moment, even though there's no doubt that it will pursue its own military objectives, particularly in the South China Sea, over the coming weeks and decades.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.